$280 billion worth of gold. It's yours for the taking, but you have to find it first. When you think of the Inca Empire, Machu Picchu, mountains, llamas, and the conquistadors might come to mind, but fewer people know the extent of riches that came from their civilization. When you think of conquistadors hungry for gold, you may think of men such as Hernan Cortés, who conquered the Aztec and plundered their riches, yet many overlook the other conquistadors who headed for Peru to find fortunes of their own. It's 1526 and conquistador Francisco Pizarro travels down the South American coast and hears stories from the natives about a kingdom so full of gold that he and his fellow comrades could live in excessive luxury for the rest of their lives. Intrigued, Pizarro leaves Spain in 1528 in order to seek approval from the Queen of Spain. Naturally, the rumours of gold in Peru were far too promising to resist, and the Queen gave him full permission to embark on a voyage to conquer this kingdom of riches. Sometime later, in 1531, Pizarro chartered a ship to take him and 200 men to Peru. Upon arrival, they were met with low resistance from the native population, since the Inca told stories that their god, Viracocha, would return from the land of the setting sun when he was needed the most, and these natives then believed that the Spaniards were gods, as their fair beards and shining armour matched the description of the god Viracocha. Meanwhile, the Inca Empire was in a state of civil war between the brothers Atahualpa and Huáscar. After their father, Huayna Capac, died of smallpox a few years prior, without naming an heir, both brothers fought for ownership of the kingdom. The war felt as if it would last forever, with the pair refusing to compromise. This was until one day when Atahualpa felt that his luck would change. With the Spanish moving towards the Inca capital of Cuzco, Atahualpa was told about the arrival of the so-called gods. Immediately, he felt elated, believing the arrival of the gods to be a good omen for him, as they seemed to have returned when the empire needed them the most. Atahualpa called for an immediate meeting between him and the conquistadors, and he felt as if victory was his already, and that he would control the empire in no time. He couldn't possibly have been more wrong. Both sides agreed to meet in the settlement of Cajamarca, where diplomatic talks between the Spanish and the Inca commenced. At this point, the Spanish lost the ruse that they were gods. Atahualpa, with the help of his spy network, had discovered that the conquistadors were not gods, yet were just foreign invaders. But he knew of their superior weapons, and planned on acquiring them to use for future conflicts. During this meeting, Pizarro and his 200 conquistadors were completely outnumbered by the 30,000 Inca under Atahualpa's command. A conventional conquest was out of the question. Diplomatic talks continued, with the Spanish growing even more impatient by the day. Eventually, an opportunity arose. Atahualpa made himself vulnerable. He met Pizarro on a golden throne surrounded by hundreds of servants, all of which were unarmed. Pizarro, believing that it was now or never, ordered his soldiers to open fire upon the Inca, which worked devastatingly. The shocked Inca army trampled each other to death as the guns of the Spanish ripped through them. Pizarro galloped his horse to the throne and snatched Atahualpa, capturing him in the process. At the end of the battle, 7,000 Inca lay dead, with only one Spaniard being injured. Successful and pleased with their victory, the conquistadors now possessed the emperor. He was going to be the key to their long-desired treasure. Keeping calm, the Spanish taught Atahualpa Spanish, in order for him to reveal the location of the gold. Fearing the worst, Atahualpa had one trick up his sleeve. He knew how greedy the Spanish were, and their lust for gold was immense. He proposed to fill a room once with gold and twice with silver in exchange for his release. Yet, in reality, he was just buying himself time before his army of 100,000 men could come and release him. Eventually, the Spanish got their riches. 3 months later, they acquired 84 tons of gold and 164 tons of silver from across the empire. This was enough gold for each conquistador to leave Peru and never have to work a day in their lives again. Pizarro was greedy, but he wasn't stupid. In 1533, accused of worshipping false idols and having his brother Huáscar executed, Atahualpa was garroted to death. Now without their leader, the Inca were vulnerable to oppression, and the Spanish had bled most of the empire's gold dry. Or so they thought. In fact, rumour has it that the Spanish only got a fraction of the gold that the Incan Empire had. One Inca general named Ruminahi was on his way to deliver 750 tons of gold to the Spanish in order to release Atahualpa. But upon hearing of his death, he hid the gold somewhere in the Llanganati's mountains, so that the Spanish would never find it. Ruminahi was captured and tortured for information on the location of the gold, but he never confessed, and the location of the treasure died with him. But there is a possibility that the treasure was hidden right under the noses of the Spanish all along. Ruminahi, just before his capture by the Spanish, ordered for the city of Quito to be burned. One of his captains, Hualca, was tasked with the destruction of the city and brought his son Cachuna along with him to assist. Unfortunately, during the destruction, Cachuna became badly injured by a well that sunk in, and was therefore believed to be dead. Fortunately for him, the Spaniard captain Hernan Suarez rescued him and nursed him back to health. He was taught to read and write and was held in high regard by Suarez, who took pity on the crippled boy. Sometime in the future, Suarez was on the verge of bankruptcy, his house to soon be up for sale and his creditors ever restless. However, his kindness paid off when he needed it the most and from the person he least expected it from. Cachuna advised Suarez to build a secret basement in his house and to fit it with equipment made for gold smelting. This would be done under only one condition, that he was to never tell anybody the source of the gold and to never know its true location. He agreed, and Suarez became a rich man who lived happily ever after. After Suarez's death, he bequeathed his estate to Cachuna, who redistributed the wealth to local covenants, churches, and the poor. Unfortunately, an Inca with such riches came under suspicion from the Spanish government, who were desperate to find the origin of his wealth. Cachuna refused to tell the truth and reveal the source of his wealth, and lied to the Spanish by telling them he made a pact with the devil. The Spanish believed this, and the secret remained hidden. Just before his death, Cachuna confessed a legend to a Franciscan monk, which he quotes. Placed in the small town of Pelaro, soil of our great Ruminahi, there ask for the Moya of Ruminahi. Continue toward the cold heights until you reach our peak of Guapa, from whose top, if the day is good, always watching in the direction where the sun rises, or to say that you will always have the town of Ambato to your backs and your eyes will always focus to the side where the sun rises, toward the three mountains called the Llanganitis that are in the form of a triangle, like that of the Calo of Tacunga, putting the mounds in a straight line toward those of Cerro Hermoso. Follow this course downhill until you reach the green lagoon that is the same that was made by hand, ordered by Ruminahi, who sent his brother the chieftain of Panzalea to throw all the gold metal desired by the ambitious white gods to free our father Atahualpa, owing to the order that the white god gave. This is but an extract from the full confession, but it does intrigue you into thinking that this treasure might actually exist. Some time passed, but the rumours of an endless hoard of gold became well known to the Old World. In 1584, the 18-year-old conquistador Juan Valverde came to the New World in order to seek adventure and fortune. Unfortunately, the life of a conquistador wasn't for him, so he decided to abandon his career and fell in love with a native girl named Catla, who was the daughter of a local chieftain. The natives and Juan got along very well. They accepted him into their society, and with his love for Catla ever growing, it seemed as if he would live the rest of his years peacefully and without trouble. But Juan, growing more homesick by the day, longed to return to Spain with his wife. But there was one huge mistake Juan made that would prevent this from happening. During the 16th century, desertion was a crime which was in no way leniently punished, and in order to return to Spain, Juan would have been tried for his offence. But the chieftains took a liking to Juan, and decided to break their vow of secrecy to never reveal the treasure of Ruminahi. In May 1589, a detachment of natives went on a 3-week expedition deep into the Llanganati mountains, and returned with half a ton of gold that was beaten into the shape of crude gold bars. The now rich Valverde set forth for Spain with his riches, and instantly became one of the richest men in the kingdom. His fame spread throughout the land, as it was nearly unheard of for a man so young to be so affluent. Later, Juan Valverde was summoned to the king's court to explain how he avoided capture and became so rich. In fear of all of his wealth being confiscated, Valverde composed his famous Derrotero, which supposedly contained instructions on how to find the treasure of the Llanganitis. The story of the Derrotero de Valverde has many versions. Some say Valverde's story was 200 years later, or that he never returned to Spain and composed the Derrotero in Ecuador. But what is known for certain is that his treasure map inspired many future explorers to risk it all for the riches of an extinct empire. Over the centuries, conquistadors, clergy, and pirates all tried to find the treasure, but it proved futile, as not a single one even found an ounce of gold. With no trace of the treasure for hundreds of years, it seems as if the legend would die out, but purely by chance, the story of the lost Inca gold would become known to the world. This story begins a few hundred years after the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire. In the mid-19th century, British botanist Richard Spruce embarked on an expedition to South America to document the diverse variety of wildlife there. He started this journey in Para, Brazil, to which he headed west to document the Amazonian wildlife. After his many successful botanical endeavours, Spruce moved towards Peru and Ecuador. It was here where he would learn about the lost treasure of Llanganati. An extract from his 1860 paper to the Geographical Society reads, "In the month of July 1857 I reached Baños, where I learned that the snowy points had observed from Pacayacu, between Tungarangua and Cotopaxi, were the summits of a group of mountains called Llanganati, from which run down to the pistaza of the densely wooded ridges I saw to the northwest. I was further informed that these mountains abound in all sorts of metals, and that it was universally believed that Incas had deposited immense quantity of gold in an artificial lake on the flanks of one of the peaks at the time of the Spanish conquest. They spoke also of one Valverde, a Spaniard, who, from being poor, had suddenly become very rich, which was attributed to having married an Indian girl, whose father showed him where the treasure was hidden, and accompanied him on various occasions to bring away portions of it." It was here where Spruce became intrigued about the lost Inca treasure, but first he needed maps and instructions. In the town of Palaro, one of the nearest settlements to Llanganites, there were stories of a botanist who researched in the area 50 years before Spruce's arrival. This man, Atanasio Guzman, was obsessed with finding the Inca treasure, and hosted many expeditions to search for it. However, although he never found it, he left a map which would become somewhat useful to Spruce. After successfully requesting the map from the Quito archives and receiving a copy of the Derrotero de Valverde, he was ready to begin his research. The original Guzman map was noted by Spruce to be rather disproportionate and full of inaccuracies, with the slope angles being completely exaggerated in the old map. Spruce then spent the next few years searching around the Llanganites for the treasure, improving the map, and exploring the old Inca mines in the north. Eventually, in 1864, Spruce left South America and returned to England, where he would spend the remainder of his life publishing many papers about his career as a botanist and explorer. And although he never found the treasure, his translation of the Derrotero and his re-sketch of the map gained the world attention, and would cause a reconquista for the missing ransom of Atahualpa. It's 1910, and the lust for Inca gold is still present. Inspired by Spruce's maps and a translation of the Derrotero, a US Army colonel by the name of E.C. Brooks set out on a couple of expeditions to find the fortune of a lifetime. His first expedition proved to be a failure. He climbed up a mountain to find the peaks of the Llanganati Mountains, where he slipped and caught his eye on a stick. With his eye swollen to the point he could not see out of it, he had to abandon his expedition to receive medical aid in Quito. His second expedition was also a failure, since in order to find the lake where the Derrotero stated the gold was, he had to move through the deep swamp in order to get to the lake. Afterwards, he set up camp on the lakeside but underestimated how much the lake would rise by. Soon, the lake had risen by 25 feet and flooded Brooks and his porters, who soon deserted him. Fortunately, they were saved 5 days later, but their efforts had been for nothing and the treasure was yet to be found. A few years later, another man tried his luck at finding the treasure of all treasures. This man was an adventurer by the name of Paul Therdecuz. Therdecuz, an engineer by trade, arrived in Guayaquil, Ecuador, in 1898. In 1901, his engineering career took off, with him receiving many successful contracts. However, after 15 years as an engineer, Therdecuz decided to take a great risk, and started preparing for an expedition to the Llanganati Mountains. He reportedly conducted a few expeditions in 1914 and 1915 with the help of a few local porters that he had hired. During his expeditions, he discovered a small lake on the side of a mountain just as the Derrotero described, and the lake would later be named after him. Therdecuz was not just an engineer, but a diver as well. He put his diving expertise to good use, as it is rumoured that Llanganati dumped the gold hoard deep into a lake. Surprisingly, he did actually find a small quantity of gold whilst diving in the lake, but it was definitely not the fortune that was rumoured. Therdecuz left the Llanganati Mountains dishevelled and emaciated. but he wouldn't give up. In 1915, Therdicus sailed to Europe to find the original Derrotero, Valverde's document which he believed to be the key to ending his misfortunes. He went to the Archive of the Indies in Seville, Spain, and hired a team of researchers at the expense of his personal finances. Some scholars believe he eventually found the original copy, but whether he did or didn't locate the Derrotero, it would not make much of a difference since Therdicus contracted pneumonia in Lisbon and died shortly after. In fact, it is highly possible that Colonel Brooks and Therdicus knew each other. In the later years of his engineering career, Therdicus was employed by the Guayaquil Players Railroad, and funnily enough, Brooks put himself down as a railwayman on his passport in order to arrive in Ecuador. When Brooks left Ecuador in 1913, Therdicus quit his job and began to plan his first expedition. Brooks, who planned to return to Ecuador for another expedition with a financial partner in 1914, planned his expedition almost at the same time as Therdicus. Even more compellingly, Brooks's failed expedition was rescued by a party hired by his father-in-law Alfonso de Troya, who was also the man Therdicus left his family with when he went on an expedition. So it may be highly possible that both men knew each other and that they were going to find the gold together. But then again, it could just be one big coincidence and the men never met. The next story of discovery in the Llanganites is that of the chance encounter between an Inca site and an ex-army captain. Eric Locke, a distinguished veteran of the First World War, was a keen adventurer, having joined the Explorers Club in 1935. In an attempt to document Amazonian tribes, he planned an expedition which would span both the Amazon basin and the Llanganites Mountains. Locke spent 16 months in Ecuador, which he then returned to New York in 1937 to showcase his findings. Locke spent 16 months in Ecuador, which he then returned to New York in 1937 to showcase his findings. Unfortunately, many people were disappointed, since Locke did not make contact with the Sabella tribe, a people known for their mysteriousness and violent behaviour. But he discovered something more important. It was apparent that Locke found an old Inca settlement with advanced features such as a canal system, as well as a few gold nuggets and trinkets. During his expedition, Locke documented the Llanganati Mountains and intended to return. However, it is believed that when he documented his discoveries, he intentionally left a few pieces of information out to present himself as a more scientific gentleman who would likely be able to gain funding easier from the scientific community. His real intention, however, was to discover the coveted Inca gold that had been rumoured to be hidden there for centuries. It's believed that Locke spent the rest of his life in Ecuador searching for gold, but, like many others before him, the elements and the disease got to him, and in 1944 he committed suicide while suffering from the effects of tropical diseases and alcoholism. But his expeditions did make for the accomplishment of producing the most up-to-date maps of the mountains, which was far more concise and proportionate than the ones made by Spruce. But it doesn't end there. Locke passed the torch of discovery to an extraordinary gentleman. A linguist, adventurer, writer, and aviator, George Miller Dyatt was born in 1883 and lived a most extraordinary life. Some of his exploits consist of designing aeroplanes from as early as 1911, only a few years after the first one was built, and his many expeditions during the 1920s to Asia and South America, and even attempts to locate the missing explorer Percy Fawcett in 1928. It is believed that he continued to live a life of adventure, where he worked as an intelligence officer during the Second World War and embarked on a couple of expeditions to the Llanganati Mountains in the 1940s. Dyatt died in 1972, and most of the information surrounding his expeditions has been passed down to two people, Andreas Salvador and Eugene Brunner. Andrews tried again in 1954, yet it rained for a straight fortnight, and the lack of progress caused him to abandon the expedition. The weather was so bad, in fact, that a porter fell off a cliff and fell to his death. But he wouldn't give up. The year after, he tried again with more helpers, but all he discovered was an abandoned mine and the frozen body of the porter that died the year prior. He went on a couple more expeditions after this, but like the first, they did not show any evidence of the treasure they sought. In 1958, Andrews was tasked with running an errand for his father. He was to deliver some papers to a man in Santo Domingo. This man turned out to be George Dyatt himself. Over time, Dyatt and Salvador developed a friendship, with Dyatt inspiring Salvador with tales of his adventures. Whilst his friendship bloomed, another explorer would become relevant. Eugene Brunner, a Swiss national, moved from Europe to Ecuador in 1938. It was here that he would become aware of the Llanganati through the book published by Lucio Marin a year earlier. Almost immediately, the enthusiastic Brunner left for the mountains, starting at the town of Palaro, which was mentioned in the Derra Terra and had been the starting point for most prior expeditions. But as expected, his first couple of expeditions in 1938 to 1939 would end in complete failure, due to his lack of preparation for the harsh elements and the high altitudes. In 1941 he made a small breakthrough, however. He discovered an Inca burial mound, as well as an old Inca road deep in the mountains, but he was running low on supplies, and had to abandon the search once again. Fast forwarding to 1947, Brunner once again goes on an expedition where he encounters a rival explorer, who also wants the treasure. This man turned out to be Diet. The two conversed greatly, but still withheld information to not give the other hints on where the treasure could be. Diet had a lasting influence on Brunner, as over a period of 50 years he had gone to embark on over 40 expeditions. He made revolutionary discoveries in finding the treasure. Over the years, Brunner and Salvador eventually met and became good friends, but not partners. According to Brunner, Salvador still wouldn't reveal the true extent of what he knew. Surprisingly, in 1963, Salvador told Brunner that he wanted to rent a helicopter in order to photograph the mountains and to get a better understanding of them. He managed to lease a small Cessna CH-1C helicopter from the army. During the survey expedition, the helicopter unfortunately crashed, leaving Salvador and his companions stranded. It's debated on why exactly the helicopter crashed, but it's believed to be due to the inexperienced pilot who had only recently graduated from flight school. Later, his efforts would bear fruit. Andrews decided that instead of viewing Brunner as a friendly rival, they should collaborate and pool their efforts to achieve their shared goal. After all, there was enough gold for both of them. Andrews told Brunner that one of his accomplices on his failed expedition climbed all the way up to the mountain of Cerro Hermoso in order to retrieve a misplaced cache of supplies that had been parachuted in. It was up this mountain where he found a mysterious tunnel. Salvador then promised to provide Brunner the funding if he wished to explore it. Now it's January 1964, and Brunner, alongside 5 porters, ascended Cerro Hermoso and explored the cave in its every inch. He then confirmed that the cave was mentioned in the Derra Terra as a sokovan. This was a monumental discovery, as Brunner and Salvador have now gotten further than any explorer before them. Within the cave was a staircase carved into the stone by the Inca, and on top of it lay a movable stone surrounded by water, which appeared to be some form of trap. Moving up the hill, Brunner discovered something even more compelling. Years earlier, when Brunner met Diet on an expedition, Diet mentioned a reclining woman and its significance to holding the treasure. Brunner at the time did not understand the meaning of this cryptic message, but it was when he got a review of the surrounding mountains he finally understood what Diet had meant. The reclining woman was an image created by combining the primary and secondary peaks of the famous 3 Llanganati mountains at a certain angle. Now, Brunner felt so very close to the treasure, and over the year went on a couple more expeditions. One of these expeditions allowed him to discover a small lake on a mountainside like the Derra Terra mentioned. He decided to name it after himself and called it Lake Brunner. Returning to Diet in Santo Domingo to tell him his adventures, Diet finally trusted Brunner enough and told him all he knew about the treasure of Ruminahi. It was then, in April 1966, where both men signed a contract of partnership. With Diet's knowledge, Brunner's time, and Salvador's money, a strong alliance was formed. Diet finally revealed his secrets to Brunner, which went as follows. In 1887, 2 British sailors actually discovered the treasure, yet their lack of preparation and planning caused them both to meet their ends prematurely, and the treasure was lost with them. It was believed that these naval officers first heard of the Llanganites from the nephew of the botanist Richard Spruce, who had been mentioned earlier, whilst they were instructing him at the Royal Naval College. Now intrigued, both men were quickly granted leave by their superiors and prepared to sail to Ecuador. As expected, the men left from the town of Palaro with plenty of provisions, porters and mules. During their expedition, the sailors, who went by the names of Black and Chapman, religiously followed the maps of Spruce above everything else, even the Derra Terra. Why? It's due to the fact they both believed that Spruce knew something but withheld it from everyone else, and in order to find what they wanted, they had to follow his map. Black and Chapman made a discovery that the Derra Terra seemed to ignore. Black documented the location of probably the world's biggest gold mine. The men then appeared to head southeast, following the Derra Terra to a mountain which they marked on the map, rather shockingly as gold hidden in cave here. It was here in which the treasure of the Inca was found by the men, and they could now live lives of luxury. And the humorous thing being that they found the treasure completely accidentally. But why didn't they extract all the riches there and then? It's believed they initially refused to extract the treasure since they first of all lacked the manpower to move it all down at once, and secondly, if their porters found out about the treasure, they may spread the location of it, and by the time they return, other explorers may have taken it. It is likely, however, that Black and Chapman shared their excess belongings and packed in as many treasures into their bags as they could. They decided to take an alternative route back to Palaro, which went very well at first despite them being seriously under-provisioned. But, as if they had awoken a curse removing the treasure, the harsh elements of the mountains came to life. With hail and fog disorienting the explorers, they desperately had to make it to safety or else they would lose their lives. Things couldn't possibly go worse for Black and Chapman. Black had broken his compass in the harsh conditions and Chapman contracted malaria, which ended up proving fatal. The thirsty, starving and exhausted Black arrived in Palaro eventually, with a paltry amount of treasure. He had to abandon most of it, as gold, being very heavy, is hard to transport across long distances and huge altitudes. It was then reported that he returned with the gold to the UK and rejoined the Navy. Brunner, however, experienced another story of the two sailors, which paints them in a much more unscrupulous light. In 1966, Brunner visited the very old grandmother of a friend in Ambato, a town near Palaro. The lady, in her 118th year, apparently saw the two English explorers when they visited her parents' house. The lone captain returned with 18 pieces of gold and gemstones, claiming his partner fell off a cliff and died. Nobody in the family believed him. They all thought he bought the treasures from looters in Palaro, who were also the same people who supplied his provisions for the trip. These stories contrast each other, with one saying Chapman died of malaria, whereas the other states he died because of his harness that came loose. You could speculate that Black tried to kill Chapman to have all of the treasure to himself, but Black himself believed others would also think this, so he potentially concealed the true cause of his partner's death in order to prevent others from thinking that he had him killed. Years later, in 1892, when Black finished his naval career, he nostalgically set out for New York aboard an old clipper as to visit a trusted friend in the USA who was in possession of all his notes regarding the Llanganati treasure, as he feared that many would try to take them from him. But he would never reach his destination, as according to the crew of the ship, Black became profoundly intoxicated and fell overboard to his death. Now it feels as if the hunt for the treasure was back to square one. However, Black was survived by his maps and correspondences, with one letter most interestingly quoting, "Maybe you cannot believe me when I tell you, there are thousands of gold and silver pieces of Inca and pre-Inca handicraft, the most beautiful goldsmith's works you are not able to imagine. Life-size human figures made out of beaten gold and silver, birds, animals, cornstalks made out of silver with golden corn ears. Gold and silver flower pots full of the most incredible jewellery, golden vases full of emeralds and other beautiful stones, golden goblets and 1,000 other artefacts." Black's notes were left collecting dust in his friend's house for decades. One day, his friend's grandchildren were clearing out the house and found all of Black's work. Intrigued, the family now wrote to the Explorers Club in London about the notes and were told that we're very lucky, as they knew a man who would be interested in this. This man would turn out to be George Dyett. Now with the context squared away, the remainder of the story will centre around Eugen Brunner, an enigmatic explorer and one of the most important people in the story of the Llanganati treasure. Brunner was born in 1915 to a Swiss mother and a German father. It's believed he took up art in his youth, which would explain his aptitude for constructing drawings of his discoveries. Before his arrival to Ecuador in 1938, he lived a most adventurous life, with him supposedly smuggling political prisoners from Nazi Germany to Switzerland. This naturally got Brunner into trouble, where he was caught and ended up spending 6 months in a concentration camp. Eventually, in 1937, Brunner believed there was nothing left for him in Europe and decided to start anew in Ecuador. A keen enemy of National Socialism, Brunner supposedly spied for the US during World War II by monitoring the activities of other German nationals in Ecuador, which according to Brunner nearly killed him twice. After the war, he continued to persist with searching for the treasure. Brunner knew of the Llanganati treasure through the book published by Lucio Marin. He embarked on many expeditions until he met the explorer George Dyett, who appeared very knowledgeable, and after many years, when Dyett seemed Brunner was worthy, he revealed to him everything he knew about the location of the treasure. Now, Brunner knew more than most, and was determined to dedicate his life to discovering the fortune of a lifetime. Brunner composed many maps of the Llanganitis, which are extremely impressive, since the inhospitable and rough terrain makes documentation extraordinarily hard, and during his initial post-war expeditions, he made many attempts to retrace the steps of Black and Chapman, as they were believed to be the last people to see the treasure. Previously, Brunner had found a lake which appeared as if it could have been man-made. He named it after himself, therefore giving the lake the name Lake Brunner. Now, as the story goes, Ruminagi, the Inca general, dumped the treasure in the man-made lake on the side of a mountain in the Llanganites. Individuals such as Locke and Therdecus have discovered lakes before, yet they have not shown the riches promised in the legend. Brunner, like Therdecus, had the ability to dive, and during his dives down into the lake he made some advancements. He first discovered a log, which at first seemed banal, yet the log did not grow natively in the area, highly indicating that the lake had been interfered with. Even more compelling, however, was the discovery of a spiral staircase, carved into the bottom of the lake, which was believed to act as a way for the lake to drain. This was a great discovery. Brunner later tried to blast the staircase open with dynamite, yet he later tried alternative approaches in fear that the sudden release of water would flood the nearby villages. With Brunner unfortunately reaching an age where he is no longer as fit as he wished to be, he needed to act fast. In 1970, Brunner made great preparation to protect the lake, which he believed to have held the treasure in a sealed crevice. These such preparations included hiring 40 porters to cut a 25-kilometre path up the mountain, flattening ground to accommodate helicopters, and telling potential investigators and rivals that Lake Brunner was actually another lake just below it. But alas, Brunner made many attempts to locate the treasure, but his health caught up with him eventually. In 1984 he passed away due to unknown reasons, but he had lived a fulfilling life, acting as the man who managed to organise sketches, maps, translations and memoirs regarding the lost riches of Llanganati, and was without a doubt one of the most determined and accomplished explorers to ever traverse Llanganites. Most of the video has been inspired by Steven J Charbonneau's book, Lust For Inca Gold. My video is just a summary of the whole story of the Llanganati treasure. If you want a tale of history, politics, romance, discovery, mystery, war, corruption, economics and business, this is a book you cannot ignore. I strongly suggest all of you read this book, for its beautiful narrative is a treasure within itself. So, do you want to make a fortune? Well, if you're brave enough to navigate the harsh mountains, harsh weather, fierce competition and corrupt government bureaucracy, it's yours, but you will have to find it first.